This is Lynn Fraser with the Killavy Center. I'm here with Joan Tollifson, and we're going to have an interview about addiction and recovery, non-duality, and her life and how she's been working with those different elements, how they all play together. This is part of the Radical Recovery series that's now monthly in between the annual summits. In a moment, I'm going to ask Joan to introduce herself and just to give us some of her story, her personal experience with addiction and recovery, and how that has worked throughout her life.
Well, thank you for having me. And I really appreciate all the great work that Scott is doing in this field. You wanted to know about my story.
Right, and in particular, how it relates to addiction and recovery in a really broad sense of the term.
Mm-hmm.
You know, with addiction, there's so many levels of recovery that can happen. So how did that work for you in your life?
Mm-hmm. Well, as a teenager, I started drinking, and alcohol was the drug that I was addicted to. It was the 60s, and I went to one of the colleges where drugs were a big thing, and the drinking age was 18, so there was a lot of drugs and drinking at that campus. And I did basically every drug that was in existence at that time, and alcohol. And although I did a tremendous number of drugs, I never felt addicted to them. I mean, I could take them or leave them. But alcohol was the thing that I couldn't take or leave, that I was addicted to. And so I drank my way through college and managed amazingly enough to graduate, and then moved to San Francisco, where I got into the lesbian bar scene. At that time, the whole lesbian culture was basically in bars. There were no women's coffee houses or other forms of, that's how you met each other. That's how you had a social life together. And so once again, I was in bars. And so, and a lot of women were having drinking problems, so there was a lot of drinking, and also drugs were very, much going around then. So I drank and did a lot of drugs, including IV drugs, which I didn't really like very much, only did them a few times. But, and again, I wasn't really addicted to drugs. I was addicted, although I did a lot of them, but I was really addicted to alcohol. And I very nearly died. I mean, I consumed amazingly combinations of things that medical people have told me no one could survive that. So, and I would wake up in bed with strangers, or in cities I didn't know where I was, or in the back of a car didn't know where I was. So, it was bad. It was really bad, and I came very close to dying. And then really, through an amazing stroke of luck, I went for the treatment of something else to a women's health clinic. Mm-hmm. And Josette Mondanaro was the doctor who was on duty that day. And I knew about her because my last lover before I sobered up was a prostitute and a junkie and a sociopath. And she'd been in prison, and Josette had been the prison doctor. And so she had talked about her. And I knew that Josette worked with alcoholics and drug addicts, in addition to working at the Women's Health Center just as a physician. So I told her I wanted to sober up. And so she said, well, come and see me the next day. And so I did. I went to see her at the community health center where she worked. And she became my therapist. All of this was free of charge at that point through the community health center service. And I did about a year of therapy with Josette, and she was a brilliant, brilliant woman. She died of a brain tumor some years ago, but she didn't believe in the AA model, which at that time was completely dominant. She regarded addiction as something that we had unconsciously chosen to do as a way of dealing with certain things, like killing ourselves, or as a way of relaxing, or whatever it might be. And so the goal of her therapy was to understand what you were getting out of drinking, what you were doing, and sort of make the choice conscious. And then she believed you could make a conscious choice not to drink. And she also believed that you did not need to be permanently abstinent, that once you dealt with the underlying issues, you could learn to drink again in a non-alcoholic manner. So I was completely sober for about 9 months, I think. And then I asked her if she thought I could experiment with having a drink. And she said she thought that would work.
Mm-hmm.
So I did. And it was fine. I didn't have any urge to keep going. And but I have to say, I did get dead drunk a few times early on with that. But never did I go on the next day on a binge or anything as I would have before. And eventually I pretty much just stopped drinking completely because a friend in AA told me that she felt like I was putting forth a dangerous ideology, you know, that people could drink again.
Oh, mm-hmm.
And I heard her, and so I thought, okay. And so there was a whole decade where I didn't touch any alcohol. And then I started again having a little, and it was like a glass of wine at a dinner party or a beer at a party or something. It was never anything that seemed problematic. Although when I look back really carefully, there was a little addictive edge to it, I think. And then in the between 2000 and 2008, I lived in Chicago. I was being with my mother at the end of her life. And I started drinking wine in the evenings. And it was, you know, I drink a glass of wine, usually 2, sometimes 3, and sometimes the whole bottle, which was 4.
Mm-hmm.
I never did more than that, but that was a lot.
Right.
And I was having blackouts. I mean, I wasn't going out and drinking. I was staying at home. It wasn't like I wasn't waking up in bed with strangers or making phone calls or having social. So it wasn't really, and I didn't really do it at all heavily until after my mother had died, because I needed to be sober if I got a call from her.
Right.
But
so it was more civilized and not as...
Yeah, it was more civilized, but I could feel that it was addictive. I mean, I could feel that there was just an addictive pull to have that second glass, even though I didn't really like how it made me feel, but it was like, I just felt I had to keep going. Mm. And there were weeks and months where I didn't drink at all. I mean, it wasn't like before at all, but it was definitely, I felt it had an addictive edge, and I tried to stop several times, and I did, and then I'd start again. And finally, I just stopped completely, and then I haven't had I don't even know how many years it's been now. 5, 6, I don't know. Mm-hmm. I'm not counting, but
right.
It's been a while, and I don't intend to drink again. Although it's interesting that in that whole time, you know, I didn't plunge back into worse and worse alcoholism, as AA says would inevitably happen. Right. In fact, I really felt like there was an awareness, you know, that I'd gotten through my meditation and everything, that there was an awareness of the whole thing as it was happening. I would just be aware of, you know, that urge for a drink and how it felt to go shopping for the bottle, and, you know, what it was like to open it. And I was just kind of paying attention, not in a really effortful, deliberate way, but it just kind of, that's my natural way in a way. So it had become my natural way through years of meditation and so on. So I think that really, I think that the key element in any recovery program is really awareness. However, the program is structured and whatever the belief is, or, you know, but I think awareness is really the key. You know, you become aware, more and more aware of what you're doing.
Right.
And the more awareness there is, there seems to be a greater possibility of making a different choice, although we can talk about choice. But I mean, you know, there's the ability to not go down that road seems to be stronger.
So let's talk about kind of how your spiritual practice, your meditation came in relation to the recovery. So you went into therapy with the doctor for a year. And were you meditating at that time, or was that something that came later?
Not really. I mean, I had been introduced to Zen meditation back in college in the 60s, but so every now and then I sat down and quote meditated, but it wasn't really, I wasn't really meditating, no. And in fact, I went into politics after that, and I got very into the women's movement, the lesbian movement, the disability movement, the anti-imperialist left.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, when I sort of left politics, I got into Zen.
Mm-hmm.
Then I met Tony Packer, who was a former Zen teacher who had left the tradition and the dogma and the rituals and all that behind, and was just doing a very simple kind of awareness work, really.
Mm-hmm.
But we did have silent retreats and all that. But her teaching was just really about awareness, about paying attention to what's going on when we get defensive, what's going on when we feel hurt, what's going on when can we notice how we're trying to, sort of get people to like us, and what's underneath that, and what's going on when we feel like we need to have a drink or
Right.
whatever it is. So her teaching was very much about just paying attention to all that, seeing all that,
Mm-hmm.
and not just while you're sitting on the meditation cushion, but throughout all of life. So, and I lived at Springwater, her retreat center, for 5 years. So, and that was during the time when I wasn't drinking at all. So,
Right.
it was, and there was no alcohol at the center, although some people there did go out and drink, but or had it secretly in their rooms. But basically, there was not alcohol around, so,
Right. Right.
so, yeah, so that's just part of, I've just absorbed that, I think. And
Right. Right. So when you went into that initial year of therapy, was it like once or twice a week or something that you saw her, or?
yeah, she actually saw me twice a week in the beginning, and she did a combination of Gestalt and transactional analysis and feminist therapy and something called radical therapy that was in Berkeley in those days. So she had her own kind of mixture of all of that. And so we were really looking at the messages I had gotten as a child, and how like drinking was a way of killing myself because I thought I'd be better off dead. And it was a way of being able to be sexual, being able to dance, being able to say what I felt like, all those things that I felt too inhibited to say if I was sober, I could do when I was drunk. And I was a very bad drunk. I would hit people and punch people and throw things, and I was very outrageous. I was not a good drunk. So, it was kind of an outlet. And I think that, when I just saw recently a movie about Jim Morrison from The Doors, and it just kind of brought up for me the feeling of the 60s, and how, well, some of the feeling was all love and peace and all that, but some of it was really rage, at sort of the system, and recognizing how sick all this was. And I think I had that rage, and it was, when I was sober, it was all contained, but when I was drunk, it could just go out there. And so sobering up was a lot about learning how to do all those things, not, destructive rage, but learning how to do all those things in healthier ways, or without needing alcohol.
So there was something that you were trying, there was some reason why you felt like you'd be better off dead. Would you talk a little bit about what was going on in your childhood that led to that?
Well, I was born with, part of my right arm and my right hand was amputated in the uterus by an amniotic band rupture. And so I was born with one arm. And that might not seem like a big deal today, but back then, I was born in 1948. Back then, disability was a whole other thing. There were no, disabled people running in the Olympics, and
Right.
it was just a really different thing. It was, and to be a disabled female was particularly bad, because women were basically judged on being physically beautiful, physically perfect. That's what women were all about back then.
Right. Yeah.
And so, that's still true. But it's, maybe there's chink in it now that there wasn't there before. But so my parents were very supportive and very wonderful. I actually had a very good childhood in many ways, and my friends were very supportive. I mean, but it was just sort of there as this theme in my childhood that um, I had this flaw, this imperfection,
Right.
um, that kind of, could be the source of children would sometimes just ask over and over what happened, or they'd say, ugh, I hate that arm, or, whatever. And so it was just sort of feeling like I had something repulsive, disgusting, unacceptable, imperfect, that I was fundamentally that way in some way. And
It wasn't just your arm. It was
yeah,
you.
it felt like it was me, and I think that's something that happens a lot with birth disabilities that doesn't happen when you lose an arm later in life, because you already have a self-image, but with people who are born with a disability, it becomes really part of your identity very often. So yeah. And then very early on, I really began, I wouldn't have been able to name it, but I began to recognize that I was a lesbian, and that, and I also, might use the word transgender. Or genderqueer. I began to realize that I really felt like a boy.
Mm-hmm.
And back then, none of that was talked about or acceptable, or, that was just, being gay was like sick. It was like, it was on the list of mental illnesses. It was illegal. People lost their jobs for it. So, again, I was sort of in this category that felt deviant and unacceptable. And of course, couldn't have even said what it was until I was maybe in high school.
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of knew about it for the first time, but not transgender stuff, but well, actually, yeah, there was a little bit of that coming into the news by then, but anyway, so I had these things that were, and then it was the 60s, and, sort of realizing that the whole 1950s culture I'd grown up in was founded on lies and deceptions and the exploitation of the rest of the world. And, just sort of this discovery that the whole country that I was in, that I'd been told was such a great, wonderful country, was actually an imperialist empire that was, it was like my whole world was kind of turned upside down. And so, yeah, I think there were a lot of reasons that, and I kind of took on the identity. I think, back then as a person with a disability, you sort of had two choices. You could either be, the Easter Seal poster children who inspired pity and charity, or you could be Captain Hook. And I kind of took on Captain Hook, and that was my bar identity. In the bars, I was kind of this tough, bad, outrageous person.
Right.
Yeah.
You have two ways that you feel really different.
Yeah.
From your family and your friends and peers growing up.
Mm-hmm.
And then that sense of being different, especially if we, it's a heady experience to find people that we can connect with later. So once you hit college and you got into the lesbian bar scene, I remember what that was like. It was so exciting to finally meet other people that were like me.
Yeah. I remember the first time I walked into a lesbian bar in San Francisco. I was like, I had my first woman lover. I met the first day of college, actually, and we became lovers at college. But it was a very hidden, secret relationship, so it was very painful. And I was drunk, and I had a lot of feelings of insecurity because I felt like I wasn't physically good enough or perfect or something. So I was easily jealous, and of course it was the 60s, so everyone was sleeping with everyone, and and so, we were both going off and sleeping with men, and, it was a mess. So it was a lot of pain, and I was quite violent. Actually, when I was drunk, I was abusive. I was an abuser. I didn't even know that. It took me years to see that, because when I was angry or abusive, my internal feeling was that I was a victim, that I was hurting.
Oh.
And so it took years, literally into my 50s or something, before I really realized how hurtful I had been and how scary I was to other people, because my internal sense was so different. And that has given me a lot of compassion and understanding for people who are abusive, that, they don't necessarily know what they're doing. People always say, oh, they claim they're a victim, well, they may actually feel that way,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and maybe for real reasons.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So what was it that shifted during that year of therapy with the doctor? So you come into it not really being able to be yourself and connect with other people without alcohol. And then you have all of these really scary, sometimes violent experiences. So what was that? What was it that got resolved or healed? What was that like during that year?
Well, she was a lesbian, my therapist. I should add that, so it was like I finally had a model of a really sober, healthy lesbian who was a doctor, a physician, and was running these programs. She founded and ran the pregnant addict program at San Francisco General. She was doing therapy and was the prison doctor. I mean, she was just this dynamic woman, and so I had a model for a lesbian who was high functioning, and 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 the therapy was incredibly, I mean, she was brilliant. It was just, I feel like we really I began to see things about what was going on while I was drinking.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in a sober household. I'd moved in with people who were not alcoholics. So I was,
Oh.
I started, being in a social scene where that wasn't so predominant. And just being sober. I mean, being sober I stopped smoking it quite soon, and I'd been smoking very heavily. I stopped smoking. Drugs just fell away naturally. I mean, I just stopped doing them. So, I just felt better physically. It was like, I can remember walking up a hill and thinking, wow, it's not that bad walking up a hill.
Yeah.
It's like, so I felt good, and I started to get engaged in things. Like, she was very much into the lesbian feminist movement, the therapist, so I started getting engaged in various political things and social things. And it was just like a complete change in my life. It was kind of it was like waking up, it was like waking up from this nightmare, really.
Mm-hmm.
Although it wasn't all a nightmare. And I have to say, I don't regret having been a drunk and a drug user, because I learned a lot, and I went places I would not have gone otherwise, for sure. And I learned a lot, and it's given me a lot of understanding and compassion and insight that I wouldn't have had otherwise. So I don't regret it. I regret I regret that I hurt people,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't regret that it happened, for me.
Well, it's interesting that it took until you were in your 50s to really let in what that was like for other people.
Yeah.
That's a big thing to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. My first lover, who from 1966, she and I ended up moving to Ashland at the same time, unbeknownst to each other.
Oh.
Had this wonderful friendship for a few years, and then she died. And I was with her during her dying process. And one of the things she said to me during that time when she was dying was that she'd had nightmares about me all her life, because I had, of my physical violence. And I had no memory of ever having been physically violent to her. I didn't know I'd even done that. And it was horrifying to hear,
Mm-hmm.
and to know that how deeply that had traumatized her. And it was very, very painful. It's painful now just even thinking about it.
Right. It is.
Mm-hmm.
I've had experience with my son when I was in a relationship that was harmful to him, and I couldn't see it.
Mm.
And it's very painful.
Mm-hmm.
Let all that in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Be present with that too. Mm-hmm. So you're in Chicago, and you've had years with your mother, yeah, and you've had years of meditation and mindfulness and the healing that comes with being able to really see. And so let's talk about choice and free will and how that works, because you're very aware of what it is that you're doing. You're aware of the compulsion, the excitement. So why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think what I've learned from, from my own experience with addiction is that, we don't have free will in the way many people think we do.
Mm-hmm.
And I should mention that in addition to alcohol and drugs, I've also had a finger biting compulsion since childhood, which is not nail biting, but actually biting the knuckles and cuticles and things, and in a quite serious way when I was younger.
Mm-hmm.
And that persisted even after I stopped drinking. Fell away recently for such a long time that I actually announced and thought it was gone. But when I got a recent medical diagnosis, I started doing it again a little bit. Now it's fallen away again. But so who knows? But it's been there since childhood. But and because my therapist had the model of choice, that you had made an unconscious choice to drink and you could make a conscious choice. You could understand how you'd made that choice, make it conscious, and then you could make a conscious choice. And then my spiritual teacher, Tony Packer, really had she was coming from really seeing how there was no choice. She would have us just really investigate how choices happen. Like really watch. You're sitting down and at some point you decide to stand up. How does that happen? Or you're making a decision about whether to take a trip and you're going back and forth in your mind and suddenly you're buying the ticket. How does that happen? Or around something like addiction. Mm-hmm. You're wanting that second glass of wine, and sometimes it seems that you can decide not to have that second glass. Right. And other times, even though you're doing it and it's addictive and everything else, you just can't stop yourself. You have that second glass. And I think many people I'm sure everyone has experienced that, or they may not have seen it in some form, but many, some of us have experienced it more vividly than others, I think. And so some people are just really stuck on the idea that, yes, you can always choose, you always have that choice. But from what I've seen in my own life, you don't. And I see it in other people too, that I've worked with, where, people who are, alcoholic or something, and they've done everything. They've gone to every treatment program. They've done everything, and they're still drinking, and they can't stop. And other people, they go to AA and they never touch another drop. What's the difference? And I realized it's not just as simple as we all have free will. These things they're very deeply in there, in our unconscious conditioned mind and in the body and in the whole system, and they're connected to things like trauma and whatever, that Scott talks about a lot, that, so it's not just as simple as, just snap your fingers and just say no. Right. And on the other hand, I think people can get stuck on the other side, because anytime we try to formulate something, it's not quite right. And so people can get stuck on the other side of there's no choice, you have no choice, and I think to avoid sort of getting stuck on any formula, but just, it's given me a great deal of compassion for people who are child molesters or serial killers or things like that, to realize that, if I can't stop biting my fingers sometime, maybe they can't stop going out and killing somebody, Mm-hmm. And in fact, I've read something by somebody who was a serial killer where that's exactly what he said. It was like a compulsion that overpowered him. And it's been interesting when the through Scott's work, actually, I started really becoming more aware of the precursor behaviors that would come before I actually started biting my fingers. Things like picking my fingers, or just feeling with my lips, or, looking at them, and different things. And when it fell away for a really long time recently, and that didn't happen because I was trying, it just suddenly disappeared. It wasn't there anymore. No. But the precursor behaviors were sometimes still there. And normally in the past, if it had fallen away several times before, but not for as long, when the precursor behaviors would start to happen, sure enough, biting would happen, within days or something. But this time, the precursor behaviors all happened, but the biting didn't. And it was just, that was very interesting. And then, at a certain point, as I said, I did lapse into biting again, but it was many months of that. And I'm going to have to stop, and my nose is running here.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I'll have a little water. Okay.
So I think it's interesting that when the pressure's on, when something's very stressful that's happening, that we will often just, our nervous system or something just drives us back to the old comforts. And so I know I've had the same experience around ice cream. So that was always what I would go to after I stopped drinking and doing drugs when I was in my 20s. That was kind of, food was my thing. Food had been my thing during my teen years too, but I couldn't always get drugs or alcohol. So, ice cream was usually available. So that was what my fallback was. But I can see now that I have a lot more choice in terms of, it's not the kind of drive that it used to be. It's not desperate in the same way it used to be. And sometimes I'll watch myself doing it anyway. And I'll go, I don't really need that. What's going on? And sometimes just sitting with it and feeling into it is enough so that I go, okay, I actually don't need that and I'm not going to. And other times I watch myself doing it. So it's so interesting that we don't have that same kind of need to get away, and yet there's something driving that behavior still.
Well, I think there is a need to get away, that we all have as human beings. I mean, it's like, let's face it, part of being human is really painful.
Yes.
There's a lot of really, really painful, scary, horrible things that happen to people in this life. And we as humans, and this is one of the things I think is at the root of addiction, because, we have this capacity that other animals don't have to imagine everything that might happen to us.
Right.
Pleasant and unpleasant.
Yeah.
And just the thought of something can trigger reactions in the body that are the same as if you see a tiger running towards you, so it's like, as I often say, no other animal smokes and drinks itself to death. Desire and fear is a natural part of our survival system, but it gets translated in human beings into things that, are fatal, like drugs and alcohol and all that. And not just drugs and alcohol, but, religion and overworking and all kinds of things can become addictive. But love, relationships, sex, I think we see now that addiction has a much bigger scope than just drugs and alcohol. But yeah, so I think that there is something in us that naturally, when you're faced with something painful, you naturally want to move away. I mean, it's a natural part of our survival system.
It is.
And sometimes you can't move away. Sometimes there is no escape. And then, again, we look for something that's going to comfort us or numb us out or distract us, and I don't think that's all bad, actually. I mean, I don't, you can go too far in the meditation direction too, and, sort of feel like, I should never watch television. I should never, if I have a headache, I should sit there and feel the headache. And, no, I'm taking aspirin, watch a movie. It's like, I mean, it's good. Like, I appreciate in Zen practice, what it was like. We had to just sit there when we were in pain and just sit through it. And I learned from that, that when you are in pain that you can't get away from, there is a way to just open to it where it's no longer overwhelming. And that's helpful. But that doesn't mean we don't take painkillers or watch TV or even, whatever, it's so I don't think that's all bad, I guess is what I'm saying. I think, and it's sort of a matter of discerning, because having ice cream every now and then is not a terrible thing. But if we're having a pint of ice cream every night or something, then it becomes a problem. It's the same with alcohol or anything else. So it's like, it's a matter of really discerning when it's actually harmful and when it's sort of crossing over into that realm of harm. And also just even like with finger biting, I mean, sometimes I sort of feel like for years I just felt so ashamed of it and everything. And then in recent years, I haven't felt that. And sort of sometimes it's just like, okay, I want to bite my fingers. It's kind of like, okay,
Yeah.
like I just need a little comfort right now. And no, this isn't the most intelligent way, but it's what this body mind organism has learned to do.
Right.
And I'm just going to let myself do it right now, kind of, or I'm not going to fight it. I'm not going to, I don't feel like I have to sit here and sort of meditate on it or something. So
Right.
it's kind of, I think that's been really helpful to me, is just kind of easing up on the sort of spiritual recovery. We've got to always be mindful and all that, just a little bit more relaxed.
So you've let go of some of the shame around that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, which was big for a long time, it's, and I think
people that are in the spiritual world, it's almost like we took our political correctness from activist movements and brought it into spirituality. And we do it to ourselves a lot of the time. I expect myself to never feel needy or never feel like I want comfort from something.
Yeah, it's like, we shouldn't be angry, we shouldn't be defensive, we shouldn't be addicted, we shouldn't have a compulsion, and I think the problem with that is that one of the problems with that is that it leads to dishonesty, because what people often do then is that we don't see what we're doing. We just convince ourselves, oh, I'm not really defensive. Or, oh, that looked like defensiveness, but actually there's no self here. It was just, a movement of the body, mind, and consciousness or something. We have these sort of ways of explaining it that I think are very deceptive.
So let's get into spiritual bypassing, and that there's two elements. One is spiritual bypassing, and it's related to kind of that spiritual high, wanting to always feel good. You mentioned that you've been looking into that whole area around spiritual addiction. What do you want to say about that?
Well, I think religion and spirituality have always been major addictions for humanity. And I'm not saying that all religion and all spirituality is bad, because I'm not one person. I'm not a person who believes that. But Karl Marx famously said something along the lines of religion is the opium of the people. And I think he was onto something. It's like, and arguably a lot of good comes out of religion, but also a lot of horror has come out of religion. And when people believe that something is the revealed word of God, and it's in the Bible, so it has to be this way or something, I think that's very dangerous. And it's kind of easy to see it in fundamentalist Islam or fundamentalist Christianity or conservative Judaism or something. But when you start to realize that it's there in non-duality and alternative spirituality as well, maybe not on such a grand scale, but it's there. And I think spirituality is this, that there's something very real in so-called spirituality, discovering awareness and just waking up to the wonder of this moment and being fully present and feeling the spaciousness and discovering the fluidity and finding out that there is no actual solid persisting self here that you can grasp onto. But then we get into these we take that to these strange extremes, like, people are like, oh, I am not the body, and I'm not really this person at all anymore, and there is no person in any sense, and that's just bullshit, really. and it becomes this way of like, I'm not really suffering anymore because I am just vast awareness, or so
it can be an escape.
Yeah, a huge escape. And we are, human beings are very prone to self-delusion and to fooling ourselves and to getting kind of hypnotized and hypnotizing others and hypnotizing ourselves. And there are extreme examples of that. And we've seen teachers who really go off the rails and, become quite abusive and crazy. But there are much subtler examples of it too. And I think it's something we all need to pay attention to, and not just think it's out there and some, horrible guru or something.
Right.
It's something that's a human tendency that we all have. We have a hunger for, mother's love, for an authority to tell us what to do, so that we finally know this is how the universe works. This is the answer. This is what you should do. This is how things are. It's uncertainty, and it's painful, not knowing, being uncertain, not really having the answers. There's an uncomfortableness in that, and we want something we want security, we want comfort, we want to know that everything's okay. And I think in a really deep sense, you could say everything is okay. But that doesn't mean that, if you have a bomb dropped on you and you've just lost all your arms and legs and gone blind, that everything's, quote, okay. And so I see things like Byron Katie's work, for example, where, she starts out with some really great questions that I think are very useful, but then I see it kind of go over into this formulaic package where people are kind of encouraged to discount and ignore and deny the actual suffering, and just sort of like, no, I can't really know that my father shouldn't have raped me, that kind of thing. It's like there's something in it that goes into a false place, something that starts out with something really good, and then I feel kind of crosses over. So I don't mean to name specific people, but yeah. So I
find that in the yoga community too, meditation, that my son Dustin was misdiagnosed with a type of cancer that would have killed him in 2004. And one person, yoga teacher, said, well, he's going to be reincarnated again anyway. So basically, what's the big deal? And I'm like, that's my son you're talking about. I am attached to him. I don't think that's a bad thing. And for 9 weeks, we thought that's what he had. And then they discovered they'd made a mistake and he didn't have any kind of cancer. So that was a big learning experience for me too. And just the depth of the turmoil and the grief and the anticipatory thing, like, you talked about how we kind of think, well, this could happen, that could happen, and how we really torture ourselves with that. And we need to work on that at the level of our real human lives. Can't just skip over that.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of cancer, I just have had a cancer diagnosis, and as you know, and, and I've been told what the side effects are going to be of the treatment they're proposing. And it sounds like I'm, in for months of basically torture, and I'm terrified, frankly. And it's interesting how different people respond. I mean, some people do respond by sort of telling you, don't worry, you know that everything is okay ultimately, and blah, blah, blah. And other people, which I really appreciate, are just like, oh, I'm really sorry this is happening to you. Is there anything I could do, or something like that? Right. And I know I've responded in the first way, and sometimes in the past. And I, now I feel like, ugh. But that whole experience of having this diagnosis has actually really brought me has been part of this sort of waking up from what I think of as sort of an emphasis in spirituality on transcendence, that I've never particularly liked, but I've at times gotten caught up in. And I've always felt like the real truth is down there in the nitty gritty, like Zen, it's right here cleaning the toilet kind of thing, And it's right here in this moment. But this diagnosis really brings me into, it's this body, and there's no, this is going to hurt. This is not going to be pleasant,
Yeah.
And
we don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah. And I'm not afraid of death, but I'm afraid of the things that can happen before death. And this life is, and I've had an incredibly lucky life. I mean, you think about people who are in this same situation, but they're in a refugee camp or they're in a war zone, you know. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there are some horrible, painful things going on this planet, you know. And
Sure.
so to have this kind of, which is why I think we're drawn to that kind of transcendent model, like just, you know, blast me out of this.
Right.
But I think it's so much the wrong way to go. So I've just, and I was at the SAN conference recently, and um, someone lent me a copy of a book by Robert Saltzman called The 10,000 Things, where he just kind of really uh, goes after that kind of spirituality. And I think reading that book, getting this diagnosis, and you know, it just kind of it spurred something in me that where I just feel like I am so done with that kind of transcendent, beyond it all spirituality, and the idea that some people are, you know, I mean, there are obvious differences between people, and yes, some people are clearer, or you could say more awake, or less deluded than others. I mean, that's true. You know, we can see differences, and I don't mean to deny those and say everybody's the same. But when people start to think that they're in some state that no other human being is in, or that they are awake now, so therefore they no longer get defensive or get angry or worry about anything, and they sort of denying all that. That to me is very, very dangerous territory.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Tony Packer really worked with that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Present moment awareness, not in denial.
Right. And
Yeah.
she did, you know, she was just very much about, and she had a sense, you know, transcendence can mean so many different things. I mean, she certainly had a sense of vast, open, spacious awareness and beingness and all that. I don't mean,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't this sort of belief system, because it's so easy to slide from an actual, something we can actually see directly and experience, into a belief that's a little leap away.
Mm-hmm.
And you see it all the time in the Advaita world, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And Tony was just very down to earth, you know, the caw, 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 the crows, and the feeling of your butt on the chair and that sort of thing, and was very down to earth and just watching. And she didn't want to be an authority, you know. She was always questioning the way that we hunger for authority and the way that we want to be an authority and all of that, and always said that anything she said could be questioned, could be taken further, could be looked into, could be challenged.
Mm-hmm.
uh, and if you asked her a question, she would look at it freshly as if she'd never looked at it before. I mean, she wouldn't just regurgitate the past answer. When she went through the death of her husband, Kyle, whom she loved dearly, she was just really, you know, she was very open about her grieving. You know, she wasn't trying to hide that, but she was also very curious about it, like when it would come and go, and she was interested in it, but she wasn't pushing it away. And then she herself went through 10 years at the end of her life of horrible pain and disability, and spent the last few years in bedridden. And I mean, it was the end of life we all dread.
Wow.
And she, you know, I think her awareness and her insight was a huge part of how she got through it. But at the same time, she had a TV right there, and she was watching TV sometime, and she was taking painkillers, and you know,
Right.
she wasn't just, you know, I just must sit here and feel this. You know, she was so. Yeah, I think she was just down to earth and real in a way that I really appreciate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And she never, you know, she was very open about her own, not always, I mean, she was human, but I think she never tried to come off as if, oh, I never get defensive anymore, or I never get angry, or oh, that doesn't happen to me anymore. You know, she was, you know, so when people would project that onto her, she would often say, where do you think I get the material for my talks?
Right.
I'm watching what happens here.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm not just watching you, I'm watching myself too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So you mentioned a while ago about being able to sit through pain.
Mm.
Can you just describe a little bit more about that? I'm thinking of people that might be listening. There's this window of tolerance that we develop for being present with our experience, and that's a real foundation for not going into addiction. And
Mm-hmm.
so if you could expand on that a little bit, and also it must be kind of on your mind as you know you're looking forward to what's coming up. How am I going to deal with this pain?
Right.
Ah,
It is. Um, well, yeah, I mean, in Zen, we had to sit these like week-long sessions where you're sitting in the lotus position or the half lotus position, which is extremely uncomfortable for most of us.
mhm.
So and the sittings would be 45 minutes long or something like that. And you're just doing, sitting and one sitting after another, basically all day into the night. And so in not much time at all, you're in incredible pain. Your legs are just incredible pain. Your back is in pain. I mean, you're just in pain. And, you're just sitting there with it. And what I noticed was that if the first impulse would be to try to get away. And since getting up and leaving was not an option, it would be like the mind would go into gear, thinking like, oh my God, what if this gets worse? I can't stand this. I'm not going to make it to the end of the period, and then the more I would think those thoughts, the tighter the body would get and the worse the pain would get. And then at some point I kind of discovered that if I just completely went into the pain, like with my awareness, so that I was just really exploring it with awareness, just feeling the sensations. But all of a sudden, something really opened up, and there was just these sensations, and they were no longer felt overwhelming. In fact, sometimes they actually felt interesting and not even that painful. Well, sometimes they were still painful.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the pain would just stop, then it would come back. But that was a big discovery, and I do think I don't really advocate that method of finding out. I mean, I'm not really a fan of that kind of Zen practice anymore, but it did serve a purpose for me.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I think it translates over into how we deal with any kind of pain, emotional pain. So, and I know that's something that I've learned, and I certainly haven't learned it perfectly, but there are times when if I start, like recently, for example, if I suddenly start to feel kind of heavy and dark and scared,
Mm-hmm.
I might just sit down in my chair and just, let's just stop for a moment and feel this instead of going with whatever impulse there might be to, get away from this,
Right.
which tends to make it worse. Or some things make it better temporarily, and then, it's worse cumulatively. But so, it has translated over into being able to stop and just kind of feel something or just be with something. Like if I went through mild depression for several years and off and on, and just being able to just stop and feel what is this, instead of getting lost in the story about it, like, oh, this is going to ruin my life and what am I going to do, and
Right. Right.
and it just gets worse and worse and worse. So I think that's crucial, in recovery work, is developing that kind of awareness and that kind of ability. And I think that's part of what we do with meditation, is just even just on a simple level, you're sitting there in meditation and suddenly your nose itches, but you're not supposed to scratch it, so it's like you just have this experience of feeling the itch and then noticing that eventually it goes away.
It does. Yeah.
And and that doesn't mean you're never going to scratch an itch again, but you start to realize that, oh, there is this other possibility of just being with this.
Right.
And that when there's the itch to do some old pattern or something, there's the possibility to just pause and feel the itch itself. Just feel, what is this urgency? What is this urge to have a drink or have some ice cream or light a cigarette or turn on another video of some guru giving a transcendent talk or whatever,
Yeah.
What is behind that? What is the uncomfortableness? And the more we actually can be with that underlying uncomfortableness or unease or restlessness or whatever it is, that underlying discomfort, the more we can just be with that, the more it turns out to be really nothing at all. It's just sensations, just thoughts and sensations. And the more you can just be with them, it's like awareness is the great dissolver, it just really, but it's dangerous to say that because the mind can then take it into, oh, I get it. I'll just do awareness and then it will dissolve. And then we're doing something else. We're doing a little thing with an agenda,
Yeah.
That doesn't work.
Well, you to bring it back to what you said about, there's the experience and then there's kind of the thoughts of the experience. And those are two very different things. The direct experience of awareness is not an escape, but wanting to have that experience of being in bliss, or at least not being in pain. Why wouldn't we want that? And yet it's not always exactly the reality. Yeah, that's a very nuanced awareness practice, I think. And I noticed when I would have an experience in meditation and then I would sit the next day for meditation, and I want to have the same experience, of course, and especially if it was a really nice one. And for years, I noticed I just started to get into some depths. It's like, oh, this is it. And it's like, then it's gone.
Yeah.
You can't chase experiences. They don't really happen that way.
Yeah. And then finally, I think we just kind of, in the beginning, we're really, we have this idea like a good meditation is when I sit there and there's hardly any thoughts and I'm just really present and everything feels so spacious and open, and that's a good meditation. And then there's the bad meditation where my mind is just really busy and I'm just thinking and I feel all tight and cramped and all this. And then at some point you sort of recognize there is no good and bad meditation. You're just seeing it all. And and there's space for all of it, and it's all part of our human experience. And you stop chasing the positive ones and trying to push the other ones away.
Right.
And there's just kind of an ability to just let it be as it is in this moment, which doesn't mean you just leave the tire flat, but people can interpret it that way, but but it's just letting it be as it is in this moment. Yeah.
Well, and you referred to there is space for you being terrified of what might be coming, and thoughts that come into our mind about that, of course they come in. We're trying to navigate through something that is probably not going to be very pleasant, and it's going to be painful, and to give yourself the room to feel that and admit that without judging yourself for it. There's a lot of space there. I can really feel that when you're talking.
Yeah, I feel that that's important because, I think there is a pitfall in spirituality where people want to say, oh, no, I'm not terrified.
Right.
And I'm happy to report that I'm not walking around thinking about all the terrible things that are going to happen most of the time.
Yeah.
As I have kind of learned, not to go down that road.
Right.
But it does come into my mind sometimes, and there is a kind of underlying terror that I can feel into when I kind of drop into it, there is. And I think feeling those things and letting them be here is important. And when we try to push them away, that doesn't usually end up in a very good place, Right. So, yeah.
And then we're just here.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool, actually.
Yeah. I mean, actually, it's the simplicity of this moment, life is pretty amazing. I mean, not always pleasantly amazing. It can be very bitter.
Right.
But, it's just the simplicity of the trees and the leaves and the snow on the mountains and the morning and, everything. It's just this.
Yeah.
And we don't need these transcendent answers, actually. It's actually possible to be here in groundlessness, in not knowing. We don't actually need to know what happens after death. We don't actually need to know how the universe works. We don't actually need to know if consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the brain or if the brain is an appearance in consciousness. We don't actually need to know these things, and we probably never will know these things. They're sort of like, we can't know everything. It's just not, we can have beliefs about, and that's where I think a lot of things that I see in the Advaita world, where, yeah, we can see everything. I never experience anything outside of consciousness. That's true.
Mm-hmm.
But to leap from there to there is nothing outside of consciousness, or everything is just consciousness, yeah, there's a leap there.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got a belief that is sort of like, oh, this is comforting, and it's the opposite from the scientific belief that, it's all an epiphenomenon of the brain, which is maybe comforting to them. And, but we don't know. That's the truth. We don't know. And we can have experiences of vastness and boundlessness and this, but we translate that into a belief, into a philosophy, into, and then we're sort of holding on to something like a comfort blanket.
I think that's the key. Yeah. Why do we need the belief? And sometimes there's just such discomfort in not knowing.
But I actually feel like the belief is painful. It's like an addiction. Like in the beginning, it seems like, oh, this is great, getting drunk, it feels really good. But at some point, you start to notice this is actually painful.
Yes.
This hurts.
Yeah.
And it's the same with belief. It's like in the beginning, it's like, oh, great, God is watching over me. Everything's fine. Jesus died for my sins. Everything is consciousness. I am boundless awareness. Great. And at some point, you start to notice, wait a minute. There's this little bit of doubt here, and this is actually painful, and when you can actually just let go into just this being here, not knowing, it's actually liberating. I mean, people think, oh, that sounds so scary and horrible. That's because when we think about it, it sounds scary and horrible. Like I won't, nothing. No, but it's like, it's not nothing. It's just this, and it's right. It doesn't need to be explained. And, it's like, it's actually very freeing. In the same way that sobering up, recovering from an addiction is freeing. Mm-hmm. I mean, that was my experience in every addiction that when it's gone away, is that, wow, this is great.
Yeah, and look at the space.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes I'm not aware how much space is taken up by it until it's gone. It's like,
yeah,
that 27,000 thoughts that happened that week, they're gone now. What's going to take its place? Yeah.
And one interesting thing that happened to me when I was doing that wine drinking in Chicago, I went to Springwater for a retreat at one point in the middle of all that, mm-hmm. a silent retreat. And in the middle of the silent retreat, somebody, I had lived there for many years, so I had a lot of friends in the area and stuff. Anyway, in the middle of the silent retreat, one of the neighbors invited me over for a glass of wine. And the thought of it was repugnant. I mean, it was like, because, I was in the middle of this silent retreat, my awareness was so open and so alert and so present. And the thought of going and having a glass of wine and having it all sort of dulled down, it just sounded horrible. And that was really interesting to me. Like, that's interesting. That doesn't sound good at all, Whereas in another moment, outside of retreat, it would sound really appealing.
Right.
And, I think part of what's appealing about a glass of wine is that you sort of drop out of the thinking mind. Right. You drop out of, Eckhart Tolle has he says instead of rising above thought, we sink back below it. It's like you're free suddenly from all those thoughts, and you are actually just kind of present in the moment, and the colors seem brighter because you're paying attention to them, and and you put on some
body
music,
relaxes. Yeah,
it's really great, and you're just listening to the music, and it's you're just present kind of,
Mm-hmm.
but you're present by sort of numbing out in a certain way.
Right. Mm. Yeah,
So,
there's something a bit ungrounded or artificial or something about that kind of relaxing. And
yeah,
I can see why it would not be appealing if you were already in a very open, spacious state in retreat.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, because I was already, out of that mind activity.
Yeah.
Not that it doesn't, I mean, I don't mean I get to some place where that isn't happening ever at all.
Yeah.
But I mean, I was already in this sort of open, present place. And so the wine had nothing to offer me. It sounded like just kind of messing things up. And it was, ugh. Yeah. That was a kind of, light bulb moment when that happened.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm. We've covered a lot of ground. What is left to say? Is there anything that you really want to talk about or point out that we haven't talked about yet around recovery or addiction in all the ways that that manifests? What would you want to say as we close?
Well, one thing I'd like to say is just that I think there are many different approaches to addiction that are possible. I think it's an open field in which new things are being discovered. And, I have a great deal of respect for the 12-step programs, but what I don't like about them is the way they monopolize the recovery field and the way that, they do have a sort of ideology that is not open to being questioned. And
Right.
so I just think that different people need different forms of how to recover. And we don't need to have the one true recovery path. There are many ways and many new discoveries and many more new discoveries that will come. So I think it's so crucial for us to keep an open mind and, just to be not to fixate on this is the answer to addiction.
Right.
And also not to, to see addiction as sort of, it is like our fundamental kind of human problem in some way. So it's not like, oh, now I'm recovered. And, I mean, yeah, some particular addiction might be behind me, but as I discovered with alcohol, it can come back, or with finger biting, it can come back.
Yeah.
So you don't know, even after 20, 30 years, you don't know. And it's the same with people who say, oh, I'm awake now, well, you might be surprised. Yourself might come back. It probably does, and you're not seeing it. But
Right.
it's like to really see this as just something to be aware of ongoingly. I mean, I don't think there's an end to awakening. I don't think there's an end to recovery. To me, it's just, those kinds of urges are part of our human makeup. Those kind of urges to escape, to find comfort, to
Mm-hmm.
to seek a better experience. Those are just built into us in some way, and they're going to come up.
Right.
So not to have that sort of finish line model, but to just have it be an ongoing thing that we're, and one form of addiction falls away, and then we notice that there's another one. Like, oh, I'm not drinking anymore, but now I'm addicted to watching YouTubes of this guru or something,
Right. Yeah.
And maybe that's healthier, but it's like, yeah.
There's a value in reducing the harm that we do.
Yeah.
Opioid addiction is more dangerous to our health and life than watching Netflix or something, but
Right. Exactly.
but it's still, there's a being wrapped up in something, there's comfort, all of those things that you mentioned, and that you just have so much room in your experience for that you don't shut yourself down or deny it or judge yourself for it. It's just, well, here's me being human.
Yeah, and that there's room for, I mean, it's not like, I mean, I love Netflix, it's like, and again, it's sort of, we can notice when it's actually enlivening us or just something enjoyable, and when it sort of slides over into, oh, I just watched 6 movies in a row and I don't feel very well, it's kind of like,
it's the mindfulness that we bring to that.
Yeah, and then not to beat ourselves up if we do something like that, or if we eat the ice cream or bite the finger or whatever. It's sort of like, okay, that happened, and it's in the past now. And now I'm here.
Right. Yeah. And now I'm seeing that. And yeah.
Yeah, not to make an identity out of it, like I failed, I'm a failure, or or I succeeded, I'm a success. But just to see it as a happening in this flow of life, which is it is really. It's
It
like
is.
weather. Yeah.
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 Yeah. It's a very spacious way to move through life, to not have all of those rigid things that we need. And if we really need to count on something, it leads to so much attempts to control, and there's so much suffering in that. And, if we need to count on it, then we need to count on it until we don't. And there's, one of the things that just talking about your life and how this has evolved, it's so clear that we don't have to stay stuck in any of those things. That there's real ways and possibilities that we can work with what's coming up and learn how to be kind and present and to just be, there's so much curiosity there. Life is so fascinating and painful at times and wonderful.
And I would say, we can when we can,
Yes.
because sometimes it seems like we can't, because there really is no little controller in here, who's sort of at the controls, authoring my thoughts. And, something much bigger is happening. And it's like, sometimes that possibility of stopping just isn't there.
Right.
And for some people, like I said, some people sobered up. My bar buddies, some of them sobered up and some of them died and some of them are still drunk, and I don't know why. I was one of the lucky ones who sobered up. I can't explain that. So to have, and I think that's essential, to have compassion for other people, who aren't able to stop, and to have compassion for ourselves when we slip, as they say.
Right. Yes. Yeah. We never make anything better by shaming ourselves or shaming someone else.
No, that is not helpful.
It's not. We have discovered that about life. Well, thank you so much, Joan. This has been wonderful.
Oh, it's been a great pleasure talking with you, and I really enjoyed it. And again, I feel just so excited by all the work that Scott and everybody there is doing. So, yeah.
Go to killabecenter.com, Radical Recovery Summit, for access to the interviews. You can watch them free online for 48 hours after they air, or you could purchase an all-access pass. killabecenter.com.